everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Sega Genesis review here on Player One Start. It's been a long journey getting to this point, but we are almost done with the gameplay. We only have a few more genres to get to, and we're going to try to cover the rest in this video. Now you're probably wondering, did I save the best for last? Well, I'm not really quite too sure, but I did save these for last. In this video, we're going to talk about racing games, sports games, and the fighting games. And as it ended up being customary in each of my previous videos, I am going to feature these games in a montage before we dive into some of them with a deeper review. So again, there are a lot of games to look at, and we're not going to be able to look at all of them that I previewed, but we are going to look at a lot of them. Let's go ahead and start with the racing games. This is Drivin. This is the first racing video game I ever played for the Sega Genesis back in the day. You can see from the opening text that this isn't meant to be an arcade racer, but more of a racing simulation, aiming to make a realistic experience. Looking at the graphics, you can tell that it doesn't look like most racing games of the time. Using polygons in a 3D racing game was something that I had never seen before prior to playing this game on a home console. However, the reason why the game was designed this way is because this is a direct port of the arcade game, which boasted better graphics, a better frame rate, and analog steering controls. Going back and playing this game now, yeah, I can see how this game has become very dated. The game in single still frames looks stunning. Keep in mind that there are no extra hardware chips being used, this is just using stock hardware. That is actually really impressive for a console of 1989, even considering the much reduced frame rate. But the frame rate is the problem that most modern gamers are going to have with this game. Unfortunately, games going for realism back in this time frame, as their goal was to provide the most realistic experience possible at the time, and we are capable of so much more now than we were back then. Overall, I think this game would be good for those that grew up with the system, or played this game as a kid. That was the driving force of my entertainment of this game today, and I didn't play it for very long. Once I made one lap, I was like, yep, I remember how things used to be, and I'm ready to move on. Again, this game is not too expensive to collect, so if you're going for games that you used to play as a kid, or you're going for that complete collection, this game shouldn't give you too much trouble.
Get ready.
Outrun was originally released in arcades by Sega in September of 1986. At the time of its release, it was known for its pioneering hardware, graphics, and innovative features such as non-linear gameplay and a selectable soundtrack. The goal of the game is to avoid traffic and reach one of the 5 destinations set up on the map. This game, while not nearly as impressive as its arcade version, is very well done, and that should be no surprise as the Sega Genesis was built around the Sega 16 arcade board, which is what was used to make this game. The influence of Outrun on future racing titles cannot be overstated. Being designed as an arcade-style racer rather than a simulation-type racing game makes this game, I think, age a bit more gracefully in the gameplay department. The graphics and sound are also very appealing as well. All of that combined makes this game a definite pickup if you own the Sega Genesis. Moving on to Super Monaco GP, this is actually another simulation racing game, but focused on Formula 1 racing. This game was initially released in arcades in May of 1989, with the Sega Genesis port coming out in September of 1990. The Genesis version of the game adds a World Championship mode. In this mode, the goal is to win a season of races and then go on to defend the title. However, the game actually starts you out with a relatively slow car. Before starting a race, you can name other drivers as your rival, and if your rival defeats you in 2 consecutive races, the loser's team will offer a seat to the winner. If the winner accepts the seat, the loser will be fired from his team, and will have to take an open seat with another team, which is usually ranked lower. However, you can also choose just to play the arcade version. Overall, the graphics of this game are very appealing, going for a more cartoony style instead of a realistic style. The game also controls very well with very tight and responsive controls, which is very much needed when you're trying to make tight corners at fast speeds. Overall, I did enjoy this game, however I didn't play it for very long, cause once you make a lap and you win a race, then there's not really much incentive for me to come back. However, back in the day, this would have occupied probably hours of my time as I would try to improve my racing and play through the entire World Championship. Overall, still a solid racing title to this day.
Ballistic presents
The Duel Test Drive 2 was a racing video game developed by Distinctive Software and published by Accolade for various home computers and consoles, including the Sega Genesis, in 1992. The focus of this game is to drive exotic cars through dangerous highways, evading traffic, and while escaping police pursuits. At the beginning of the game, you choose your car and level of difficulty before driving on different terrains. The goal of each level is to reach a gas station at the end of the course in the least amount of time. Stopping at the gas station is not mandatory though. You could drive past it, but you will run out of gas eventually, thus losing a car. You only start out with 5 cars at the beginning of a race. You can also lose a car by wrecking it. And if you choose a manual transmission, you can also lose a life by redlining and constantly blowing the engine. Crashing into a police car instantly ends the game, regardless of how many lives you have left. Police cars appear in every level, and if the player is driving faster than the speed limit when encountering one of the police cars, it will follow in pursuit. If at any point the police car is able to pass the player's car, the player is forced to pull over and receives a ticket stating the offense and the speed of the vehicle. You don't lose a life if this happens, however you will lose a lot of time. To add a bit of strategy to your gameplay, the car will actually alert you through a radar system if a police car is in your vicinity. The player can choose whether or not to try to slow down or try to outrun the cop. Overall, I did find this game very enjoyable. The graphics and sound are of the time period and a bit more impressive of those on the Sega Genesis. But what really made this game good to me was the gameplay. I think if this game had not included the police chases, I don't think it would be as fun. But again, my main criticism of this game is the fact that they were trying to go for a somewhat polygonal racetrack. It does look very dated, especially when viewed on modern displays. This also hurts the frame rate, but not as bad as I noticed on games like Hard Drivin. Another minor issue that I had with this game is the fact that I actually found it hard to stop at the gas stations in time. I will note that others noted that the controls of this game are a bit tedious to control, and this game is not very well regarded in other reviews. However, while this game may not be for everyone, I would definitely say if you like racing games of this time period, you should give this one a try. But if you really want a good racing game from this time period, I would recommend the next game. Road Rash II is a racing vehicular combat video game developed and published by Electronic Arts for the Sega Genesis in 1992. The game is based on a series of road races throughout the United States that the player must win to advance to higher difficulty races, while using a combination of fisticuffs and blunt weaponry to hinder the other racers. Being the second game in the series, this game introduces a 2-player split-screen mode for competing human players, as well as nitrous oxide charges on certain bikes. Upon its release, this game was met with very huge commercial and critical success. Personally, this is my favorite game in the series, and possibly my favorite racing game on the Sega Genesis. As much as I enjoy playing this game in single-player mode, I think my favorite way to play this game is with 2 players. I have many fond memories of my brother and I battling it out on this course when we would rent this game over a weekend. Even though the 3D graphics and style may look a bit dated today, I think the visual appeal is still upheld, and the main draw to this game is going to be that 2-player gameplay. If you are collecting games for the Sega Genesis, and even if you're not really that big of a racing fan, I would still recommend this game to collect for your Sega Genesis as an essential game to own. Chase HQ 2 was known in arcades as Special Criminal Investigation. It was originally released in 1989 for arcades, published by Taito, and is the sequel to the original 1988 Chase HQ. And my initial impression of this game, at least just by looking at the graphics, seems to very closely remind me of games like Outrun. However, it is important to remember that games back in the day all followed a very similar style based on the capabilities of the system at the time. However, where this game differs is in its gameplay. Instead of just being a checkpoint racer where you try to get as far as you can, or win the race in the very end, your goal is actually to stop and apprehend criminal suspects. This game kind of reminds me of a very early version of games like Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, and I definitely enjoy this gameplay style more than just the standard racing fare. I will say my biggest criticism of the game are the sounds, that definitely gets on your nerves after a while. The music isn't too bad, but after hearing the sirens go on for quite a while, it definitely made me want to turn down the volume. But overall, it's a solid enough game, and I'm definitely glad I have it in my collection. One thing that I like about racing games, especially on some of these early platforms, is that they showed about the maximum capability for 3D style graphics on each system. And it's even still kind of true to this day that racing games kind of show out the maximum potential of each console. But now that we got those out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into what I think was probably one of the most influential genres on the Sega Genesis. Let's dive into some of the sports titles. California Games was originally released in 1987 by Epix. And you might call this one of the first viral sports games because it was eventually released on almost every single platform at the time and soon after. As you can guess, this game is a compilation of games that were seen as popular in California during the late 1980s and early 1990s. A couple of the games I tried out for the Genesis version happened to be the Half Pipe with the skateboard and Hacky Sack. Overall, I feel that this port of the game is very solid and definitely worth a pick up on the Sega Genesis, as I feel it's one of the better versions I have played. Cyberball was originally released by Atari in arcades in 1988. It was eventually reprogrammed for the Sega Genesis 2 years later, with Sega doing a pretty accurate job of bringing the arcade experience to the home. In this game, the player takes control of a robotic football team in the year 2022. The rules of football have been greatly simplified since human participation has been forbidden. The ball itself is now a ticking bomb that heats up with each play, and the only way to defuse it is to get it across the 50-yard line, turn the ball over on downs, or score a touchdown. There are no field goals or punts in this game, and each time the ball explodes, the player holding it will be lost. If you want to replace the player, it will cost money. Overall, the game's graphics and sounds really do remind me of some of those early Genesis titles that I don't enjoy as much because they haven't really found a way to perfect the games on the system yet. And although I find the concept intriguing, I really find myself wanting to play a more accurate representation of football rather than this game. Ah yes, the Madden series of football games got its start in 1990, published by Electronic Arts, and very quickly became a killer app for the Sega Genesis. Despite missing the holiday season of 1990, it sold extremely well, selling close to 400,000 copies at the time when the company's projections were only 75,000. In this game, only a total of 16 teams were available to choose from. Each of these teams are based unofficially on teams from the 1990 NFL season. Basically, you're choosing teams by their city and their colors rather than by their team names and players. However, as a bonus, an all-Madden team was included. I have to say that I really only ended up playing this version of Madden because of its status in video game and Sega Genesis history. This was my first time actually playing it for the Sega Genesis, as I played a version that was a few years after this one. As for which Madden game is the best on the platform, I personally couldn't say for sure, as I have not played all of them, and I am of the opinion that the differences between each game are really minute and really can't be compared to say which one is definitely better than another. But maybe you have a different opinion. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think is the best Madden on this platform and why you think that way. This game was released on a variety of platforms as well, and I think this is probably one of the later versions of this game, as I remember playing it on the Nintendo Entertainment System a few years before this game was released. But compared to the perspective you get with John Madden Football, you can tell that this game is a little bit dated in its presentation. However, it is a solid port of this game and performs very well on the Sega Genesis.
NFL Football 94.
As for the game I find the most nostalgic, that would be NFL Football 94 starring Joe Montana, produced by Sega Sports for the Sega Genesis in 1993. I believe this game came packed in with our Sega Genesis when we got it in 1994. So besides Sonic the Hedgehog 2, this was the other game I had to play initially.
Yard line. A 60-yard kick. The Niners will start 1st and 10 at the 19-yard line.
So there could be an entire video devoted to all of the sports games ever released for the Genesis. I mean, there are a lot of them. But going forward, I'm actually just going to focus on one game from each sport that was cited as the best in its category. In terms of what is the best hockey game on the Sega Genesis, I frequently saw NHL 96 by Electronic Arts at the top of several people's lists. We already saw an early soccer title as part of the launch games video that I did, so I'm just going to focus again on another game that people have cited as one of their favorite soccer games on the system, and that is FIFA Soccer from Electronic Arts, published in 1994. In terms of favorite basketball games on the system, NBA Jam is a personal favorite of mine and has been frequently cited as one of the best on the system. Frequently cited as one of the best boxing games on the system was Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing. Compared to boxing games before this title's release, I can definitely see where it is more realistic, and I did have some fun playing it, not noting anything really uniquely good or bad about it. PGA Tour Golf III was frequently cited as the best golf game for this system, and this is a type of sports game that I actually do enjoy playing, although I realize it's not for everyone. What I like about this game is that it really does encapsulate what some of the early golf games were like in the mid-90s, with the golfers actually being digitized animations, and the game background changing based on the location of your ball. Overall, I had an enjoyable experience with this game, and I would probably come back to it again if I was going to play a golf game on this platform. One thing that really helps Sports Talk Baseball out here is that it actually has an official Major League Baseball Players Association license, as well as following most of the rules and aspects followed by Major League Baseball. This game is not only cited as one of the best baseball video games on this platform, but also one of the best of all time. And I gotta tell you, even though I'm not that big of a fan of baseball video games in general, I did have fun playing this game, and would probably come back to it even before playing some of the more modern games.
Next up, number 33. Here it comes. The runner hits for second. Hits to second. Picks it up, throws to second. He's out and throws to first. Safe. 4%. Next up, number 44.
So in terms of best volleyball games on the Sega Genesis, I think this is actually limited by the fact that it is the only one I could find for the system. And there's not really much to say except, yeah, it is volleyball, and it might take you a little bit to get used to the controls, but once you do, it's actually not that bad of an experience. There are a few tennis games for the Sega Genesis, however this is the only one that I have in my collection. So I won't say it's the best version of the game, but this game is fairly decent, and if you are a fan of tennis, then I would recommend this game for pickup.
$15, $40. Game, server.
Sports games were a huge deal on the Sega Genesis. The fact that they were marketing this system more towards adolescents and wanting to seem cool meant that they had to have some strong sports titles. It turns out that adolescents really wanted more realistic sports games, and that was going to be another driving feature for this console. However, you may have noticed in a lot of my game capture footage that I kind of let the computer drive for a little bit because I'm not really as into sports games in general, and I think that some of the titles on older systems really don't have much interest to me. I know some of you may find them nostalgic, and I even had a couple in there that I found nostalgic because I played it as a kid, but for the most part, in terms of going back for nostalgia, I'm not really going back to any system for the sports games, unless it was something that was specifically meaningful to me. So for newcomers to this system, although sports games may be a good way for you to get into it, it's just not really my favorite genre to go back to on this console. And that also holds true a little bit with the fighting games. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of them. Primal Rage is a versus fighting game developed and released by Atari Games to arcades in 1994, and eventually made its way onto the Sega Genesis. This game is mostly an attempt to capitalize on the success of versus fighting games that were storming arcades and home consoles in the mid-1990s. However, due to its excessive amount of violence commonplace in games of the time, it also was sparked in controversy as well. Reviews of this game at the time were very mixed. Reviewers were especially critical that the sprites were too small and the graphics in general were very unimpressive, especially in this Genesis version. Also noted, and a complaint I agree with, are that the controls are a straight translation from the arcades version for button control. This makes the special moves particularly difficult to execute, and I never really found myself having much success doing those. I also agree with the fact that the characters looked like they were cut and pasted into the game, not really blending in well to the backgrounds. Of course, this was common with games that pre-rendered their graphics, however I feel it was done more successfully with other titles. This game is also based on an earlier revision of the actual arcade game, so some features and special moves are missing that you might think are actually there. Overall, while I do feel nostalgic for the arcade version of this game, I don't really see much point of playing it on this console, other than this being your only option. Now here's a game I remember a lot more from my childhood on this console, and that is Mortal Kombat II. This game was originally released by Midway for the arcade in 1993. It eventually made its way to the Sega Genesis the following year. Mortal Kombat II, being the second game in the series, improves on the gameplay and expands the mythos of the original Mortal Kombat, notably introducing more varied finishing moves, including several fatalities per character and new finishers. The game's plot continues from the first game, featuring the next Mortal Kombat tournament set in the other dimensional realm of the Outworld. This game was an unprecedented commercial success and was acclaimed by most critics, receiving many awards, and has been featured in many top game lists for multiple platforms since its release. The Sega Genesis home ports were always seen as the essential port to own. That is because it retains all of the blood and fatality moves without having a special code to be entered, unlike the original Mortal Kombat. When this game was released on September 9th, 1994, dubbed Mortal Friday, an unprecedented number of more than 2.5 million copies of this game were shipped between all the platforms it was released on. I'm not quite sure I can objectively review this game without being fueled by a lot of personal nostalgia. All I will say is that this is a very faithful port of the arcade game, and it would be worth a pickup for you to play on the Sega Genesis. Fatal Fury 2 is a video game released by SNK for the Neo Geo arcade and home platforms, and was later ported to several other home systems, including the Sega Genesis. When this game was released, it was very well received by critics, with some praising the Genesis version for its 6-button controller support and character graphics. After all, the 6-button controller was primarily released to help with home translations of fighting games. However, they were critical of the sound effects and music that played throughout the game, although I didn't really find myself minding it too much. Overall, I do find this version graphically impressive. Despite not having as many animation frames as the arcade version, they actually get the sprites just about right considering the limitations of this console. Overall, I would say that this game offers kind of an average experience, but one of my favorites to come back to on this platform. The gameplay reminds me a lot of Street Fighter, and it is fairly easy to control once you get used to it. Eternal Champions is one of Sega's own fighting games developed in 1993 and published for the Sega Genesis. It is one of the few fighting games at the time developed from the ground up as a home console title rather than being released in arcades first and then ported to a home system. The game tries to set itself apart with unique features such as a heavier emphasis on story, characters pulled from different time periods, reflectable projectiles, force fields, fighters that carried weapons, and elaborate stage-specific finishing moves called overkills. When this game was released, this game was given a mixed reception. Some gave it a high score, calling it at least as good as Street Fighter II. However, others described it as a major disappointment, citing mediocre graphics and unexciting characters. Overall, while I don't agree that this game is as good as Street Fighter II, I do feel like it is kind of a typical knockoff of the series. Not really done bad, but it just makes me wish I was playing a game I was more familiar with. So I was incredibly surprised to find a port of Virtua Fighter 2 on the Sega Genesis. If anything, I thought it would have been a 32X title, but it turns out that they actually released this game for the Genesis after they dropped support for the 32X. Again, I also thought they would use the Sega Virtua processor chip they developed to port Virtua Racer over, but they didn't do that either. Instead, you're stuck with a game that actually looks nothing like Virtua Fighter 2. They basically took the 3D structure of Virtua Fighter 2 and rendered it down entirely in 2D, using more traditional hand-drawn sprites replacing the motion-captured 3D models from the original game. It appears the only reason that this game even exists is because players were slow to transition from their Genesis to a Sega Saturn, which I believe has a much superior port of this game. Unfortunately, this is where the Genesis was showing its age very much. Although the graphics are very well done and impressive, the gameplay controls and the music suffer a lot, and I don't find myself coming back to play this game very often. World Heroes, previously released on the Neo Geo arcade platform, is another arcade version that I don't think fares well on this console. The characters move a bit too slow, and the animation is very choppy. I'm also not a big fan of the sound effects as well. However, the game is not unplayable, and I would rank it somewhere between mediocre and average. So I decided to classify WWF WrestleMania the arcade game as a fighting game rather than a sports game, mainly because it is designed like the arcade fighters that were very prominent in the mid-90s. This game features digitized representations of wrestlers that were prominent during the mid-90s in the WWF. The Genesis port of this game retains most of the voice commentary samples from the arcade game and allows for 4 wrestlers on screen at once. However, the game slows down when this limit is reached. Overall, in terms of graphics, sound, and decent controls, I would rate this game again as mediocre to average, not making it a necessity to play, but if you're a fan of the WWF around this time period, you will find this game incredibly nostalgic and may be worth a pickup for you. And last but not least, I'm not sure I can encapsulate the major importance of Street Fighter II for the Sega Genesis in just this little clip. What I will say is that the Special Championship Edition shown here was the first that ever made it to the Sega Genesis, and its release was a major victory for gamers who preferred the Sega Genesis over the Super Nintendo in the early 1990s. And while I don't feel qualified to make a determination on which version of Street Fighter II is essential for the Genesis, I can definitely say this one is worth a pickup based on my gameplay experience of this game alone. So we showcased some classic and iconic titles, and again, this was another genre that saw its rise during the life cycle of the Sega Genesis. Before the 16-bit era, there weren't too many games that were in this specific genre that were very fun to play. But overall, these aren't really my favorite games to play by myself. I really enjoyed playing these with a second player, as playing against the computer after a while gets really old really quickly. And yes, if you go back and look at some of the footage from the fighting games, I actually let the computer drive a little bit so you can see more than 5 seconds of gameplay because I kind of get my butt handed to me very quickly as I am severely out of practice with these games. But I do find myself being a bit more nostalgic for these titles, especially because of how big they were in my childhood, and these were games that a lot of gamers talked about back then. And of course, we found it cool that these games were, they were gory, or they were realistic in terms of violence, and we just want to get our hands on it. It was just, a fad that I think has kind of gone by the wayside a little bit. But there are still a few of these franchises that are going strong, even still to this day. Alright, so again, I'm going to ask the question, what games did I miss in this video? Again, I have to tell you that I'm only featuring games that I own in my collection. There are a few of those games that are new to me that I decided to feature because they were listed as some of the best fighting games or racing games or sports games on this console. But I'm sure there are classic and iconic titles that are out there that I haven't heard of yet, so please leave a comment below. I'd really like to see what your take is on this. That said, that's actually going to wrap it up for this part of the Ultimate Sega Genesis review. And if you're thinking there's nothing possibly more that I can cover, that I've covered it all, or there's only little bits and pieces I couldn't possibly make another video on this, there's actually 2 big things I've omitted from this review so far. And that is the Sega CD and the Sega 32X. So that's right, we're going to take a little break in this series, and when we return, we are going to talk about each of those add-ons and compare some of the games that were released for both the cartridge part of the Sega Genesis that didn't use any of the add-ons, and we're going to compare that to the upgraded graphics on the Sega CD, as well as some of the exclusives for it, and then we're going to come back and look at the Sega 32X. There weren't that many games released for the 32X, so we are going to be able to cover most of them, if not all of them. It depends on how many I can collect before that video comes out. So stay tuned for those videos. Again, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Again, I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.